Welcome to the next episode of the Impact Policy Podcast. I really hope that these episodes are something that you're getting some sort of value on. And today's episode is going to be called Impact Policy Decides to Build a Not-for-Profit. And I'm going to take you through a little bit of the thinking around the not-for-profit journey that we're going on at Impact Policy, some of the community work that we've been doing behind the scenes. It's about to take that next step and really about to see some more significant impact. So really hope you enjoy this episode. If you've ever thought of, going down that path, or if you're passionate about community work, or if you're not from the not-for-profit sector, I'm sure it's going to be a conversation that you might get a lot from today as well. We're recording on Gadigal country today at Impact HQ, so I want to acknowledge that we're here. I want to pay my deepest respects to our elders, both past and present. I want to recognise and acknowledge that this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. When I first started Impact Policy, one of the first, we're almost 5 years old now, and one of the first things that we did as an organisation was start a scholarship program with a local community organisation. And it was really important for us to do that before we'd even, generated any type of profit. It was very clear from the beginning that what the work that we were going to be doing was going to be a purpose-driven, impact, motivated sort of journey that we were going on. And so over the years, we've had different iterations of what that scholarship programs looked like. We've sponsored community organisations like the police and community youth clubs that have run, free programs for community kids to access different sports. 1 year we actually created a scholarship program internally where we actually reached out to, I think it was 12 different black businesses that all donated $1,000 each. And so 1 year we created over 10 $1,000 scholarships for Aboriginal young people around Sydney. And that was a really special memory for us to be able to do that, because it was about, again, the principles of access. Anyone could apply for those scholarships for their kid, and it wasn't means tested. It wasn't about telling us your poverty or trauma story. It was about tell us how deadly your kids are, and we'll do our best with our selection committee to allocate it as best we can. That was a great experience, and then over the years it's morphed and grown again. And so where we see ourselves today is we see ourselves over the past 12 months, we've been investing pretty heavily into sponsoring community girls basketball program. Personally for myself, I've got a selfish investment and connection to that program because my daughters are a part of it. But I guess what that's been able to give me in my own community is a real insight into the impact of access to that program for girls in her team, and that network more broadly, because I've been able to see some of the barriers that exist for some of those families that without the access, sponsorship or support, participation can become a real barrier for their kids. And so the really personal story about that is that actually takes me back to being a kid and growing up in Glebe. So when I was a kid and I grew up in Glebe, we didn't have a lot, and I was really lucky to fall into this basketball program that really looked after myself and looked after a lot of other young kids from Glebe, from all types of backgrounds. It took me a couple of years before I started to realise that my experience and participation in that program had been supported. I didn't understand at that time as a child. I just figured I had access, the barriers had been broken down and I could participate. But there were many periods across my adolescence. I came from a very disadvantaged family. I've experienced youth homelessness. My parents have, dealt with mental health and drug addiction most of their lives. And so my adolescence and childhood was really, really tough. But access to that program gave me this constant. It gave me this constant connection to a community, to a team, that no matter how chaotic the world was at home, in my community, no matter how chaotic things were within the school environment, where I got expelled from year 7 in the first 3 weeks to, spending most of year 8 in a timeout room in, what would be some sort of form of, isolation for a young kid as well, is like, I always had access to this safe space that was, there was nothing deficits about it. It wasn't that it was for kids that were in trouble, or it wasn't a special thing that, was for kids that were like disengaged from school or anything like that. It was just something that I had access to because the barriers had been removed, and so I could be a part of this community with other kids that were from the struggle in my community. But there were other kids there as well that, parents were flying and they could cover their fees, and everyone could participate together. But what that meant for me over the years was that when I had really, really hard times, that became such a really significant third place for me. And I didn't realize, I did realize at the time, but my experience over the last 18 months with my daughters really brought up a lot of those memories again around how significant that space was. And I grew up in Glebe, and this program, is based in Redfern. So if you're not from Sydney, these communities are like cousins. They're on the doorstep of each other. So a lot of these young people and families, I either know them or I'm connected to them in some way. And many of the stories and journeys are very familiar as well. So that's the sort of backstory around why this sort of makes sense for me in terms of the amount of money we sponsored and invested over the past 12 months as an organisation at Impact Policy. I've worked as a social worker. I've coached representative level sport in another life, and one thing I've noticed is the representation of women and girls in sports and how dramatically it declines as young women transition. I think it's we did some research around a recent video we produced for some funding we applied for, and it was something like by ages 15 to 17, more than 50% of women and girls in sport have dropped out and no longer are playing. I know how significant the drop-off period is from primary school to high school. And for particularly one of my girls, access and participation was really hard unless there was a safe space that was a girls only space, a women's space, to be able to come together to play, to train without boys around, without any shame or stigma that might be around, but just really creating spaces for girls to be able to come together, to be able to engage and play and participate in the sport. And so seeing how valuable that was for one of my daughters really reinforced for me, or helped me see that like there actually is a real gap, particularly around women and girls only sports places and spaces in Sydney, and particularly how that's even more heightened when we start to think about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander kids in our community and other young girls from culturally and linguistically diverse parts of our communities as well. So that was the real impetus of where we've got to in terms of our journey now moving forward. So now we're progressing in this direction of actually establishing a not-for-profit program that can facilitate, at the moment what it looks like is we've got over 20 young girls from across Redfern and South Sydney that play every Saturday morning in a competitive club competition against girls from all the other communities across Sydney as well, just like every other kid, having a great time, looking amazing in their basketball uniforms and making great friends and being healthy. Every Monday we run a free Learn to Play program at the National Centre of Indigenous Excellence. That's about, again, a safe girls-only space where, girls can come, make new friends, learn the game of basketball, build their confidence, and then if they want and if they're ready, they can transition into the club programs on the weekend too. So that's the impetus of where it started. And then I guess the journey that we're going on in terms of this not-for-profit journey is about really recognising we're working with a law firm around establishing, I didn't realise that establishing a not-for-profit was such a massive process legally, right? In terms of establishing that as an entity. And one of the biggest things that we had to do in that conversation was talk about like what this is and why we're doing it. My biggest thing was that like at Impact Policy, a lot of people listening to this probably know that like we're quite probably, I guess, respected for the work that we do in the justice space. We do quite a lot of work in justice, particularly youth justice. Before impact policy, I spent over 10 years in the community sector working with young people. And we often hear this rhetoric in this conversation around innovation. You know, we need to be innovative in how we respond to youth crime. And I like to challenge that and to put the mirror back onto people talking about things like that, particularly when we come from an early intervention lens. Because my experience, my lived experience in our communities and my professional experience tells me that actually, if we just give our girls, our boys, any of our kids in our community the same access, the same equity and the same inclusion as every other kid in their classroom, then 9 times out of 10, you know, that's all we need to do. We don't need to do anything innovative and creative and different. That's not dismissing the reality that needs to be a trauma-informed approach, that there are kids with complex needs, that there's a range of other factors we need to be conscious of. But that comes into how we think about that conversation around what does equity look like? What does participation look like? How do we break down some of those barriers so that every kid in that classroom starts at the same starting point as well? In this program, that looks like making sure, obviously, financial barriers are, you know, not existent. So we sponsor that. So families that are already experiencing financial hardship don't have to worry about an added cost on top of their kids having access to something great for them. The data that we collect that talks about some of the barriers that families might be experiencing. And the biggest barrier that families are experiencing is family responsibilities. You know, we've got a lot of single parent families with multiple kids, particularly really young kids. And so participation around transporting their kids, many of them aren't driving as well, and so their kids then miss out on participation in these programs, not because the families don't want them to do it, not because the kids don't want them to do it, but because there's actually really logistical and reasonable barriers that exist for these families. So we're really trying to establish this, you know, community care style of how our communities used to function for so long, you know, which is about how we look after each other, how we support one another, how we support our families and our friends to come and experience this sort of stuff collectively. You know, right now that looks like transport support. You know, it looks like having the team bus on a Saturday and picking up the kids that, you know, parents can't get them in there. And, you know, that's the highlight for the weekend for those kids at the moment anyway, is that bus trip. There's some just real-time examples of how we're really trying to strip away some of the barriers that exist. And there's some of the things that, in my experience, when I've worked in the community and I've applied for funding and I've, you know, tried to get support for our programs, getting support for that sort of stuff is actually sometimes really, really complicated, you know, or maybe not as supported. You know, when we say we just need someone that can pick up our kids and drop them at you know, training, when it's considered as something that's should be a child's experience, you know, like BAU, it's considered maybe less than, when really it's actually some of the critical glue to keeping these kids more connected, more pro-socially to their communities more broadly as well. So that's some of the motivation to sort of move down this not-for-profit route. We've got, you know, over 20 young kids within just this year. We've only been 3 weeks into our, you know, program series already. We've got over 20 young women that are involved in the program. We've got an EOI out where we're getting different kids, parents registering different kids, you know, every couple of days. And it looks like by the next semester, we're easily going to be able to field another team for these girls. And, you know, the numbers are continuing to grow. And I think the magic is in the simplicity. We're not doing anything special. We're just literally trying to peel away any barriers that exist for participation and just being able to try and support young kids to be able to thrive. Yesterday afternoon, we ran one of our first training sessions, and we had 2 girls come that their friends had brought them down to the program. These kids are 11 and 12 years old, and both of them have never ever played any type of structured sport their whole childhood. and they're just so happy and thriving and a part of this program because they're there with their friends, they're there in a safe space, it's a girls only space, and they're just fully involved and immersed in what's going on there. And for us, like, that is what it's all about. We know that for some of these kids there's some really complex stuff going on at home, so to be able to create a safe space, a strong space that's full of role models, and he's really trying to embed female leadership across each team and the program. That's the pathway that we're going down. That is something that's really, really powerful. So that's the pathway that we're going on with it. And we're calling it at the moment like the Impact Academy, and it looks like it's a basketball sort of program at face value, but the idea is it's about those principles of access, equity, inclusion and justice. And so that transcends just thinking about basketball. That transcends how we think about access to our communities more broadly for young people. It's about how we, teams are great examples of creating communities and connections, but there's other ways we can do that as well for kids in our communities that maybe don't want to be athletes or play sports, and different things like that too. So that's the sort of journey that we're on. It's really exciting, and I think it makes sense and is a natural progression because from day one at Impact Policy we've had this commitment to invest in, give back to, and have a tangible impact to the communities in which we live, work and play in. And so being so aggressive with that from the start is probably the real writing on the wall for us, that like we probably should have been doing this from the beginning. I find it hard pressed to find many other consulting firms that have been so focused on that social impact piece. For us, it's really critical to our fabric as an organisation, and this impact journey with our not-for-profit is one piece of that, but that flows on to how Impact Policy does its business in a range of other ways as well. We've got pro bono policies for our services for the not-for-profit sector, for organisations experiencing hardship, and we really try and champion those same values, access, equity, inclusion and justice, that we talk about in that not-for-profit community-driven space. We really try and champion them within our business operations here at Impact as well. So that's a bit of a background to our journey, our why in terms of our community impact work and where we're going to from here. So if you've listened and you've got this far and you want to support the work that we're doing in some capacity, we're always looking for like-minded people that can be a part of the journey in terms of where we go to from here. Very much at the establishment phase. We're lucky we've got pro bono support from a high-profile law firm to really support us on that legal journey with building it. But yeah, if this stuff resonates with you and you want to stay connected and support the journey that we're on, there's plenty of opportunities to do that on the road ahead. So please reach out to us. There'll be a reference piece in the show notes. You'll be able to see a link to our social media site for the program, as well as a number of other ways you can support us and the team as well. So yeah, I think that's in episode 41, 42 around why we're establishing a not-for-profit, and that's actually been a really valuable exercise for me just to talk about that sort of stuff out loud as well. So yeah, thanks so much for staying, and really hope you enjoyed it. Talk to you soon. See ya.